Austria, and Prussia, two powerful German states, were at the brink of war. The old Habsburg monarchy found itself in political unrest after the death of Charles VI, ruler of Austria and Holy Roman Emperor. His daughter, Maria Theresa, was the only direct successor of the Habsburg monarchy. Prussia, Bavaria and France found an opportunity to challenge Austria, backed by Great Britain, the Dutch Republic and Hanover. All this tensions culminated into a massive war that swept the continent, giving the opportunity to Frederick, young King of Prussia, to invade Austria, starting the First Silesian War. In the early 18th century, Prussia's ruling house of Hohenzollern held dynastic claims to various duchies within the Habsburg province of Silesia, a populous and prosperous region contiguous with Prussia's co-territory in the Margraviate of Brandenburg. Besides its value as a source of tax revenue, industrial output, particularly minerals, and military recruits, Silesia held great geostrategic importance to the belligerents. The valley of the Upper Oder formed a natural military conduit between Brandenburg, the Kingdom of Bohemia and the Margraviate of Moravia, and whichever power held the territory could threaten its neighbours. Silesia also lay along the northeastern frontier of the Holy Roman Empire, allowing its controller to limit the influence of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and of the Russian Empire within Germany. Prussia's claims in Silesia were based, in part, on a 1537 inheritance treaty between the Silesian Pious Duke Frederick II of Legnica and the Hohenzollern Prince-Elector Joachim to Hector of Brandenburg, whereby the Silesian duchies of Liegnitz, Wallau and Brieg were to pass to the Hohenzollerns of Brandenburg should the Pious dynasty in Silesia become extinct. At the time, the Habsburg King Ferdinand, the first of Bohemia Silesia's feudal overlord, rejected the agreement and pressed the Hohenzollerns to repudiate it. In 1603, Hohenzollern elected Joachim III Frederick of Brandenburg separately inherited the Silesian Duchy of Jagendorf from his cousin, Margrave George Frederick of Brandenburg-Ansbach, and installed his second son, Johann Georg, as Duke. In the 1618 Bohemian Revolt and the ensuing 30 Years' War, Johann Georg joined the Silesian estates in revolt against the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II. After the Catholic victory in the 1621 Battle of White Mountain, the emperor confiscated Johann Georg's duchy and refused to return it to his heirs after his death, but the Hohenzollerns of Brandenburg continued to assert themselves as the legitimate rulers of Jagendorf. In 1675, the Great Elector Frederick William of Brandenburg laid claim to Liegnitz, Wallau and Brieg when the Silesian Pious line ended with the death of Duke George William of Liegnitz, but the Habsburg Emperor disregarded the Hohenzollern claims and the lands escheated to the Bohemian crown. In 1685, when Austria was engaged in the Great Turkish War, Emperor Leopold I gave Great Elector Frederick William immediate control of the Silesian exclave of Schwiebus in return for military support against the Turks and the surrender of the outstanding Hohenzollern claims in Silesia. After the accession of the Great Elector's son and successor, Frederick III of Brandenburg, the emperor took back control of Schwiebus in 1694, claiming the territory had only been personally assigned to the late Great Elector for life. As a young prince, Frederick III had secretly agreed to this repossession in return for Leopold's payment of some of his debts, but as monarch he repudiated the agreement and reasserted the old Hohenzollern claims to Jagendorf and the Silesian Pious heritage. Two generations later, the newly crowned Hohenzollern king Frederick II of Prussia formed designs on Silesia soon after succeeding to the throne in May 1740. Frederick judged that his dynasty's claims were credible, and he had inherited from his father, King Frederick William I, a large and well-trained Prussian army and a healthy royal treasury. Austria was in financial distress, and its army had not been reinforced or reformed after an ignominious performance in the 1739 Austro-Turkish War. The European strategic situation was favourable for an attack on Austria, with Britain and France occupying each other's attentions in the War of Jenkins' Year and Sweden moving toward war with Russia. The electors of Bavaria and Saxony also had claims against Austria and seemed likely to join in the attack. Though the Hohenzollerns' dynastic claims provided a legalistic casus belli, considerations of realpolitik and geostrategy played the leading role in provoking the war. The 1703 Mutual Pact of Succession provided that if the Habsburgs became extinct of male line, these possessions would go first to Maria Josepha and Maria Amalia, daughters of Emperor Joseph I. Since Salic law excluded women from inheritance, this agreement required approval by the various Habsburgs' territories and the imperial diets. Charles succeeded Joseph in 1711 and 2 years later issued the Pragmatic Sanction. However, it also modified the 1703 agreement by placing the rights of his own children first, and after his first child, Maria Theresa, was born in 1717. Charles' internal and external policy was dominated by ensuring her succession ahead of his two nieces. Bavaria and Saxony refused to be bound by the decision of the imperial diet, while in 1738 France agreed to back the just claims of Charles Albert of Bavaria, despite previously accepting the Pragmatic Sanction in 1735. Attempts to offset this involved Austria in the 1733–1735 War of the Polish Succession and the Russo-Turkish War of 1735–1739, and it was weakened by the losses incurred. The situation was compounded by a failure to prepare Maria Theresa for her new role, and many European statesmen were skeptical Austria could survive the contest that would follow Charles' death. With the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, Charles had established his eldest daughter, Maria Theresa, as the successor to his hereditary titles. Upon his death, she duly became ruler of Austria, as well as of the Bohemian and Hungarian lands within the Habsburg monarchy. During Emperor Charles's lifetime, the Pragmatic Sanction had been generally acknowledged by the imperial states, but when he died, it was promptly contested by Prussia, Bavaria, and Saxony. An opportunity arose for Prussia to press its claims when Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI died in October 1740 without a male heir. Frederick saw in Austria's female succession an opportune moment for the seizure of Silesia, calling it the signal for the complete transformation of the old political system in a 1740 letter to Voltaire. He argued that the Pragmatic Sanction did not apply to Silesia, which was held by the Habsburgs as a part of the imperial domain rather than as a hereditary possession. Frederick also argued that his father had assented to the sanction in return for assurances of Austrian support for Hohenzollern claims on the Rhenish duchies of Jülich and Berg, which had not yet materialized. Meanwhile, Prince-Elector Charles Albert of Bavaria and Prince-Elector Frederick Augustus II of Saxony had each married one of Maria Theresa's older cousins from a senior branch of the House of Habsburg, and they used these connections to justify claims to Habsburg territory. Frederick Augustus, who ruled Poland-Lithuania in personal union, was especially interested in gaining control of Silesia to connect his two realms into one contiguous territory which would nearly surround Brandenburg. Frederick's concern to prevent this outcome contributed to his haste in moving against Austria when the contested succession provided an opportunity. As Prussia reactivated its Silesian claims and prepared for war against Austria, several other European powers made similar moves. Charles Albert of Bavaria launched a claim to the imperial throne along with the Habsburg territories of Bohemia, Upper Austria, and Tyrol, while Frederick Augustus of Saxony laid claim to Moravia and Upper Silesia. The kingdoms of Spain and Naples hoped to seize Habsburg possessions in northern Italy, while France, which viewed the Habsburgs as traditional rivals, sought control of the Austrian Netherlands. The electorates of Cologne and the Palatinate joined these to form an alliance known as the League of Nymphenburg, which aimed at the diminution or destruction of the Habsburg monarchy and its dominant position among the German states. Austria was supported by Great Britain in personal union with the electorate of Hanover and eventually Savoy, Sardinia, and the Dutch Republic. The Russian Empire under Empress Elizabeth also indirectly took Austria's side in the wider conflict by making war against Sweden, a French ally at the time. Maria Theresa's aims in the conflict were, first, to preserve her hereditary lands and titles, and second, to win or compel support for the election of her husband, Duke Francis Stephen of Lorraine, as Holy Roman Emperor, defending her house's traditional preeminence within Germany. After Emperor Charles's death on 20 October, Frederick quickly resolved to strike first. On 8 November, he ordered the mobilization of the Prussian army, and on 11 December, he issued an ultimatum to Maria Theresa demanding the cession of Silesia. In return, he offered to guarantee all other Habsburg possessions against any attack, pay a large cash indemnity, acknowledge the pragmatic sanction, and give his vote as Elector of Brandenburg in the imperial election to Maria Theresa's husband. Not waiting for a response, he and his troops prepared to advance into Silesia. European warfare in the early modern period was characterized by the widespread adoption of firearms in combination with more traditional bladed weapons. 18th century European armies were built around units of massed infantry armed with smoothbore flintlock muskets and bayonets. Cavalrymen were equipped with sabres and pistols or carbines. Light cavalry were used principally for reconnaissance, screening, and tactical communications, while heavy cavalry were used as tactical reserves and deployed for shock attacks. Smoothbore artillery provided fire support and played the leading role in siege warfare. For this reason, the era is also referred to as the Age of Gunpowder Warfare, a concept introduced by Michael Roberts in the 1950s. This entire period is contained within the Age of Sail, which characteristic dominated the era's naval tactics, including the use of gunpowder in naval artillery. Strategic warfare in this period centered around control of key fortifications positioned so as to command the surrounding regions and roads, with lengthy sieges a common feature of armed conflict. To do this, engineers developed a style of fortress known as the Italian style or Tres Italian. These had low, thick, sloping walls that would either absorb or deflect cannon fire. In addition, they were shaped like stars, with bastions protruding at sharp angles. This was to ensure that every bastion could be supported with fire from an adjacent bastion, leaving no dead ground for an attacker to take cover in. These new fortifications quickly negated the advantages cannon had offered to besiegers. Decisive field battles were relatively rare, though they played a larger part in Frederick's theory of warfare than was typical among his contemporary rivals. The Silesian Wars, like most European wars of the 18th century, were fought as so-called cabinet wars, in which disciplined regular armies were equipped and supplied by the state to conduct warfare on behalf of the sovereign's interests. Occupied enemy territories were regularly taxed and extorted for funds, but large-scale atrocities against civilian populations were rare compared with conflicts in the previous century. Military logistics was the decisive factor in many wars, as armies had grown too large to support themselves on prolonged campaigns by foraging and plunder alone. Military supplies were stored in centralized magazines and distributed by baggage trains that were highly vulnerable to enemy raids. Armies were generally unable to sustain combat operations during winter and normally established winter quarters in the cold season, resuming their campaigns with the return of spring. The Prussian army mobilized quietly along the Oder frontier in early winter and launched its long-awaited attack that would become Frederick's first campaign on December 16, 1740. After the death of Charles VI, Maria Theresa, his daughter, ascended the throne. The Habsburg monarchy was originally subject to Salic law, which excluded women from inheritance. The pragmatic sanction, however, allowed Maria to become successor. This became a European issue that started the Austrian War of Succession. Frederick II, King of Prussia, managed to strike first, launching an attack on Silesia, a rich region of Central Europe, in mid-December 1740. The Prussian army under Kurt Christoph Graf von Schwerin invaded Silesia and met the Austrian army under Wilhelm Reinhard von Neipperg at Mollwitz, which would become Frederick's first battle. The Prussian army had massed quietly along the Oder during early December 1740, and on 16 December, without a declaration of war, Frederick moved his troops across the frontier into Silesia. The Prussian force consisted of two corps totaling 27,000 soldiers, while Silesia was defended by an Austrian garrison of only 8,000 men. The Austrians were able to offer only light resistance and garrison a few fortresses. The Prussians swept through the province, taking control of the capital at Breslau without a fight on January 2, 1741. The fortress at Ohlau was also taken without resistance on 9 January, after which the Prussians used it for their winter quarters. By the end of January 1741, almost the entirety of Silesia had come under Prussian control, and the remaining Austrian strongholds of Glogau, Brieg and Neisse were besieged. After leaving winter quarters in early 1741, the Prussian forces began a spring campaign, and on 9 March Prince Leopold II of Anhalt-Dessau took Glogau by storm. In late March, an Austrian force of around 20,000 under the command of Wilhelm Reinhard von Neipperg crossed the Sudeten Mountains from Moravia and broke the siege of Neisse. On 5 April, Neipperg's army caught Frederick II completely off guard as he lingered in the province and surged northwards past Frederick and his army to relieve the city of Neisse, which was being besieged by a small Prussian force and had not yet fallen. Both Neipperg and Frederick rushed northwards in parallel columns in a race to reach the city first. In atrocious weather, Neipperg reached Neisse first and set up camp there. Frederick and his entire army were now caught behind enemy lines, with a large Austrian force lying between him and the rest of his kingdom, and his supply and communication lines cut off. Both sides knew that battle was now inevitable. Captured Austrian soldiers told Frederick the exact position of Neipperg's forces at Mollwitz, and the morning fog and snow allowed Frederick's army to advance undetected to within 2,000 paces of Neipperg's camp. Most commanders would then have given the order to charge the camp and rout the Austrian army, but since Frederick had never fought a campaign or a battle before, he instead decided to deploy his army in a battle line. There was very heavy snow on the ground, which caused snow blindness, and Frederick miscalculated the distance to the river on his right. He deployed several of his units behind a bend in the river where they could take no part in the battle, and several more units were deployed perpendicular to his 2 battle lines on the right flank. It is said that Schwerin commented early on that Frederick miscalculated the distance. Neipperg was unprepared for battle when he discovered Frederick's entire army was approaching. Not only were Austrian troops still in bivouac and cooking food, but they were scattered across 3 villages, with their front facing away from the Prussian advance. Had the Prussians attacked at this time, they would have encountered only disorganized resistance. Because of the 2-hour delay caused by Frederick dressing his battle lines, the Austrian army had the opportunity to concentrate its forces and form a battle line. By the time the forces engaged one another just before p.m. At the beginning of the battle, the Prussians had the larger army. They also had 3 times the field guns than the Austrians had. However, the Austrian cavalry outnumbered the Prussian cavalry 2-1. The Prussian forces advanced toward the Austrians into lines, while the Prussian artillery began bombarding the Austrian line. 6 regiments of Austrian cavalry on the extreme left flank of the Austrian line, numbering 4,500 to 5,000 men and horses, were goaded by the Prussian bombardment to charge the Prussian right flank without orders from Neipperg. The charge shattered the Prussian cavalry, who received the attack while at a full halt. Frederick was with the Prussian cavalry and was caught up in its rout. This left the Prussian flank open to attack, and the Austrian cavalry then turned on the unprotected infantry. Schwerin, the Prussian military commander under Frederick, now advised the king to leave the battlefield because it looked as though the Prussian army was about to be defeated. Frederick heeded this warning. Abandoning the field, he was nearly caught and almost shot. Frederick's absence allowed Schwerin, a veteran general, to take command of the troops himself. At this point of the battle, the scene was chaotic. Having scattered the Prussian cavalry, the Austrian cavalry continued its attack on the Prussian infantry. They charged the infantry repeatedly. The firing of Prussian soldiers from the second line, who were trying to stop the Austrians, was also killing Prussian soldiers in the first line. When asked whether the Prussians would retreat, Schwerin answered, over enemy bodies. In fact, the Prussian infantry, which had been rigorously drilled and trained under Frederick William I, held firm and continued firing rapid volleys into the Austrian cavalry, causing it tremendous losses and killing its commander, General Roma. After the repulse of the Austrian cavalry, Schwerin reformed the infantry and ordered infantry units that were short on ammunition to strip the dead of theirs. He then ordered the right flank of the Prussian infantry to advance toward the Austrian infantry line, with the left flank receiving the order to advance a few minutes later. This resulted in an oblique order attack on the Austrian infantry line, with the right flank of the Prussians overlapping the left flank of the Austrians. In addition, the Prussian infantry's use of the recently invented iron ramrod allowed them to fire 4 to 5 shots a minute with their flintlock muskets, which was 3 times more rapid than any other European army at the time. This combination of discipline and firepower quickly overwhelmed the Austrian infantry, which consisted of a large number of raw recruits lacking the training of the Prussian infantry. Soon, the Austrian line collapsed from left to right, and the Austrian army was routed from the field. In the end, the Prussians won a close victory against a numerically inferior enemy due to the leadership of Field Marshal Schwerin and the superior training of the Prussian infantry. After the battle, the Austrian army was not pursued and remained intact. Neipperg retreated to Nysa, remaining in Silesia to await reinforcements. Frederick returned to his army the morning after the battle, restored his lines of communication, and subsequently brought the siege of Brieg to a successful conclusion. After the battle, Frederick censured himself for his mistakes and learned from them, writing later that Mollwitz educated him and his army. The battle showed that Frederick could depend on the superior training of the Prussian infantry in a battle which had proven itself able to withstand the charge of Austrian cavalry. Realizing that the cavalry would have to be reformed to be able to hold its own against the excellently trained Austrian cavalry, he soon instituted a training program to discipline the Prussian cavalry in coordinated action and precision that would increase its effectiveness in both reconnaissance and battle. Mollwitz also illustrated the effectiveness of the oblique order, a tactic Frederick would use in most of his later major battles. In spite of the fact that the battle had been a near disaster for Frederick and was not won through his direct command, the victory raised his prestige in Europe by demonstrating that Frederick was capable of challenging the Habsburgs and emerging victorious. The Prussian victory also made it clear to Maria Theresa that she would not be able to reassert her control of Silesia easily, and that Prussia was a military power that would have to be more carefully reckoned with. After Austria's failure at Mollwitz to repel the Prussian invasion, other powers were emboldened to attack the beleaguered monarchy, widening the conflict into what would become the War of the Austrian Succession. France declared its support for Prussia's seizure of Silesia in the 5 June Treaty of Breslau, and in July joined in the Treaty of Nymphenburg, by which France and Spain committed to support Bavaria's territorial claims against Austria. French forces began crossing the Rhine on 15 August, joining the Bavarian forces on the Danube and advancing toward Vienna, while a Spanish Neapolitan army attacked Austria's holdings in northern Italy. Saxony, formerly an Austrian ally, now joined the French alliance, and Britain declared itself neutral to prevent French or Prussian attacks on Hanover. Faced with the prospect of a total partition of her realm, Maria Theresa worked through the following months to regroup and prepare a counterattack. On 25 June, she received her formal coronation as Queen of Hungary and Pressburg and began trying to recruit a new army from her eastern lands. In August, she offered Frederick concessions in the Low Countries and a cash payment if Prussia would evacuate Silesia, though she was immediately rebuffed. Meanwhile, fresh enemies attacked Austria on multiple fronts. The Franco-Bavarian force seized Linz on 14 September and advanced through Upper Austria, reaching the vicinity of Vienna by October, while Bohemia was simultaneously invaded by the Saxons. Seeing Austria's distress, Frederick opened secret peace negotiations with Neipperg in Breslau, even as he continued to publicly support the League of Nymphenburg. Although Prussia was allied with the French, the idea of France or Bavaria becoming the dominant power in Germany through Austria's destruction did not appeal to Frederick. With British urging and mediation, on 9 October Austria and Prussia agreed to a secret armistice known as the Convention of Klein-Schnellendorf, under which both belligerents would cease hostilities in Silesia though maintaining their appearance, and Austria would eventually concede Lower Silesia in return for a final peace to be negotiated before the end of the year. Neipperg's Austrian forces were then recalled from Silesia to defend Austria against the Western invaders, abandoning Neisse after a sham siege in early November and leaving the whole of Silesia under Prussian control. After the invasion of Silesia by the Prussian forces, Austria tried desperately to repulse the invaders. They marched north, cutting the Prussian lines of communications. This led to the Battle of Mollwitz. With the Prussian victory, many European powers such as Bavaria, France, Spain and Naples joined Prussia in its attack on the Habsburg monarchy. With Austria being invaded from all sides, Prussia signed an armistice, but that wouldn't last long as Prussia began moving forces in Moravia and Bohemia, facing the Austrians in the Battle of Chotusitz. In mid-October, Charles Albert of Bavaria and his French allies were encamped near Vienna, ready to besiege it, but he became concerned that Saxony and Prussia would seize parts of Bohemia, which he had also claimed. The French also deprecated a decisive move on Vienna, wishing to see Austria reduced rather than destroyed. So, on 24 October, their forces turned north to march instead on Prague. The Bavarian, French and Saxon armies converged in November, besieging it and ultimately storming it on 26 November. Charles Albert went on to proclaim himself King of Bohemia on 7 December. Meanwhile, in early November, Frederick negotiated the border between putative territories of Prussian Silesia and Saxon Moravia with Frederick Augustus of Saxony, also securing French and Bavarian support for his seizure of the entirety of Silesia, along with the Bohemian county of Glatz. As the Franco-Bavarian allies made territorial gains, Frederick became concerned that Prussia might be sidelined in the eventual peace agreement, so he repudiated the Convention of Klein-Schnellendorf, accusing the Austrians of violating its secrecy, and joined the general advance southward into Bohemia and Moravia. In December, Schwerin's army advanced through the Sudeten into Moravia, occupying the capital at Olmütz on 27 December, while Prince Leopold's army besieged the fortress at Glatz on the edge of Bohemia. In January 1742, the imperial election was held at Frankfurt, where Bavarian elector Charles Albert was chosen as the next Holy Roman Emperor. In early 1742, Frederick organized a joint advance through Moravia toward Vienna with the Saxons and French, which began after their forces met on 5 February at Wischow. The French, however, proved reluctant and uncooperative allies, and after the seizure of Iglau on 15 February, they withdrew into Bohemia. The Prussians and Saxons marched on toward Brunn, the main Austrian stronghold remaining in Moravia, but they made little progress due to the substantial Austrian garrison and a shortage of supplies. The Saxons abandoned the effort on 30 March and returned to Bohemia, where they would remain until withdrawing completely from the war in July. The Moravian campaign achieved no significant gains, and on 5 April the Prussians retreated into Bohemia and Upper Silesia. As the Moravian advance collapsed, Charles Alexander of Lorraine, Maria Theresa's brother-in-law, led a reinforced Austro-Hungarian army of 30,000 through Moravia toward Bohemia, hoping to disperse the Prussians and liberate Prague. Frederick took the offensive and moved into northeast Bohemia. By 16 May, he had 10,000 infantry at Kutna Hora, with 18,000 men under Leopold of Anhalt-Dessau, a day's march behind. Charles was thought to be some distance away, but in the afternoon of 16 May, his cavalry ran into Leopold's rearguard. Recognizing he was in contact with the Austrian main force, Leopold accelerated his march to close the gap with Frederick. At 2 o'clock am on 17 May, his exhausted troops stopped at the small village of Chotusitz, 3 hours' march from Kutna Hora. Instructed to hold until Frederick reached him, Leopold deployed south of Chotusitz, his infantry facing southeast, with cavalry on either flank. The left was commanded by Waldo, the right by the 70-year-old veteran von Buddenbrock. Leopold, leaving room for Frederick's infantry to deploy when they arrived. Charles of Lorraine hoped to attack before Frederick could reach him, but was not ready to do so until 7 o'clock am. As he advanced north from Kaslav, his army drifted slightly to the right, allowing Buddenbrock's cavalry to outflank them. Frederick arrived on the field at 8 o'clock am. To provide time to organize the infantry, he ordered the Prussian cavalry to charge, supported by field artillery. They drove the Austrian cavalry back, but the day was hot and dry, raising a huge cloud of dust and effectively blinding them. In the confusion, some units attacked in the wrong direction, allowing Karl Joseph Bathiany and Liechtenstein to rally their men. Both sets of cavalry began looting each other's baggage trains, an act of collective indiscipline that rendered them useless for much of the battle. The Austrian artillery had been bombarding Chotusitz. Around 9 o'clock am, Daun's infantry stormed the town, slowly driving Leopold's forces from house to house. As they did so, they set it on fire, the smoke adding to the confusion caused by the dust and making exercising command almost impossible. By 10:30, Frederick's fresh infantry were deployed in a great square of 24 battalions. Wheeling left, they fired into the Austrian infantry outside Chotusitz. His flanks exposed by the cavalry's disappearance, Charles decided to settle for a draw. He ordered a general retreat through Kaslav, leaving some of his heavy guns behind. Liechtenstein's cavalry held off the Prussians, and by noon, combat had ceased. The battle left the basic strategic situation unchanged. Charles was still able to move against Prague, while the Prussian presence in Moravia remained a threat to Vienna. Habsburg policy was generally to avoid fighting on too many fronts at the same time, although Prussia was the most dangerous, but also the most difficult to defeat. Although recovering Silesia remained a Habsburg priority for decades, Maria Theresa was willing to agree a temporary truce with Prussia to improve her position elsewhere. In the aftermath of Chotusitz, Prussia intensified its efforts to reach a separate peace with Austria, and negotiators from the two belligerents met again in Breslau in late May. Frederick now demanded almost the whole of Silesia, as well as the county of Glatz. Maria Theresa was reluctant to make such concessions, but the British envoy, Lord Hindford, pressed her to make peace with Prussia and concentrate her forces against the French. The British Treasury had financed much of Austria's war effort through cash subsidies meant to weaken France, and Hindford threatened to withdraw Britain's support. If Maria Theresa refused to concede Silesia, the two belligerents eventually reached an agreement in the 11 June Treaty of Breslau, which ended the First Silesian War. Under this treaty, Austria conceded to Prussia the large majority of Silesia, along with the Bohemian county of Glatz, territories which would later be consolidated to form the Prussian province of Silesia. Austria retained the remainder of Bohemia and two small portions of the extreme southern end of Silesia, including the Duchy of Teschen and parts of the Duchies of Jagendorf, Troppo, and Neisse. These lands would later be combined to form the Crown land of Austrian Silesia. Prussia also agreed to take on some of Austria's debts that had been secured against assets in Silesia, as well as committing to remain neutral for the remainder of the ongoing War of the Austrian Succession. This arrangement was formalized and confirmed in the Treaty of Berlin, signed July 28, 1742. The First Silesian War ended in a clear victory for Prussia, which secured some 35,000 square kilometers of new territory and around 1 million new subjects, greatly enhancing its resources and prestige. However, by twice making a separate peace while the War of the Austrian Succession raged on, Frederick abandoned his erstwhile allies in the League of Nymphenburg and earned a reputation for diplomatic unreliability and double-dealing. With Prussia removed from the wider war, Austria launched a major counterattack and began regaining lost ground on other fronts, and the diplomatic situation shifted in Austria's favor. Prussia's seizure of Silesia also ensured continuing conflict with Austria and Saxony. Maria Theresa's determination to recover Silesia would lead to renewed conflict with Prussia in the Second Silesian War only 2 years later, with a Third Silesian War to follow after another decade. Saxony would take Austria's side in both future conflicts. In the territorial settlement that ended the war, Prussia gained control of extensive new lands in Glatz and Silesia, a populous and densely industrialized region that would contribute substantial manpower and taxes to the Prussian state. The small kingdom's unexpected victory over the Habsburg monarchy set it apart from German rivals such as Bavaria and Saxony, marking the beginning of Prussia's rise toward the status of a European great power. The seizure of Silesia made Prussia and Austria into lasting and determined enemies, beginning the Austria-Prussia rivalry that would come to dominate German politics over the next century. Saxony, envious of Prussia's ascendancy and threatened by Prussian Silesia's geostrategic position, also turned its foreign policy firmly against Prussia. Frederick's unilateral withdrawal from the Nymphenburg alliance and its repetition at the end of the Second Silesian War angered the French court, and his next perceived betrayal. A defensive alliance with Britain under the 1756 Convention of Westminster accelerated France's eventual realignment toward Austria in the diplomatic revolution of the 1750s. The treaties of Breslau and Berlin cost the Habsburg monarchy its wealthiest province, and capitulating to a lesser German prince significantly dented the Habsburg monarchy's prestige. The House of Habsburg was also defeated in the imperial election, calling into question its preeminence within Germany. The Austrian army had found itself outmatched by the more disciplined Prussians, and in late 1741 the Nymphenburg alliance had threatened the Habsburg monarchy with disaster. However, peace in the Silesian theatre gave the Austrian forces a free hand to reverse the gains made by the French and Bavarians the previous year. The Western invaders were driven back up the Danube Valley in early 1742, and Saxony withdrew its forces from Bohemia after the Treaty of Berlin, making peace with Austria near the end of the year. The Franco-Bavarian forces occupying Prague were isolated and besieged, eventually giving up the city in December. By mid-1743, Austria would recover control of Bohemia, drive the French back across the Rhine into Alsace, and occupy Bavaria, exiling Emperor Charles VII to Frankfurt.